Sermon on the Mount. It covers the 5th, 6th, and 7th chapters of the book of Matthew. We're going to read verses 38 through 42 together to begin with. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist him who is evil. But whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. And whoever shall force you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. This passage brings up the eye for an eye concept of justice that I guess so many of us have heard about. People are familiar with eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and other things like that. You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person. Eye for eye justice was actually God ordained. When he said, you've heard that it was said, he was talking about those that were speaking about the law that had been given through Moses. Exodus 21 in verse 24, for instance, says, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Leviticus 24 verses 19 and 20 speak about it as well. If a man injures his neighbor, just as he has done, so it shall be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Just as he has injured a man, so it shall be inflicted on him. Deuteronomy 19 and verse 21 says, thus you shall not show pity. Life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. And so it clearly was part of the law of God that was given through Moses. There's not any way around it. Deuteronomy 19:21 is actually an extremely powerful verse because it begins with the admonition, do not show pity. It had a valid purpose. There is a reason why this was given. It held individuals responsible for the harm that they caused others, and hopefully gave them pause before they would do such harm. It also upheld a plaintiff's right to justice. But it took vengeance out of the hand of the plaintiff and instead placed it in the hands of God, who had set forth what the punishment should be. He mandated that the punishment had to fit the crime. That's the point that's being made here. If someone harms you, knocks your tooth out, you don't get to kill them for that. There's a limit. And so, if you read through the whole law, taking the life of another's animal costs you your livestock, not their life. Now, to contrast that, the law in our own nation in years past, especially in the Western territories, would get you hung for taking a man's horse. And that's the very thing that God is protecting against when he says that justice shall be eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, is preventing someone from going beyond what is right and just in seeking vengeance. Leviticus 24, verses 17 through 22. If a man takes the life of any human being, he shall surely be put to death. The one who takes the life of an animal shall make it good, life for life. And that's really what life for life meant, like for like. If a man injures his neighbor, Just as he has done, so it shall be done to him, fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Just as he has injured a man, so it shall be inflicted on him. Again, the idea being, I don't get to take your life because you've injured me. There shall be one standard for you. It shall be for the stranger as well as for the native. For I am the Lord your God. And what he's saying here is this. And I think sometimes that last statement is misunderstood. Yes, the law was applicable to both of them, but the real point's being made is that not only could I not strike out in vengeance against my neighbor, but even a sojourner in the land who's harmed me, I don't get to strike out in vengeance against him either. I have to follow the law regarding those things. And what this put an end to is a concept of justice that had prevailed in mankind since the very beginning. Go all the way to Genesis chapter 4 with me. All the way back to Genesis chapter 4. We're going to read starting in verse 23, and listen to what Lamech says. Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zillah, listen to my voice, you wives of Lamech, give heed to my speech, for I have killed a man for wounding me, and a boy for striking me. If Cain is avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 77-fold. So Cain was one of the sons of Adam and Eve, and he was concerned that people would seek vengeance upon him after he killed his brother, and God said that he would inflict vengeance sevenfold on anyone who would come against Cain. That was the protection that God gave Cain when he sent him out and made him a wanderer on the earth. Well, Lamech picks that up and runs with it and says, well, if Cain is avenged sevenfold, then I'm going to be avenged 77-fold, and I put it into practice. There was a man who wounded me, so I killed him. And a young boy struck me. Well, I killed him too. And that's the way that we tend to think about vengeance. When someone does something to us, we do to them not just what they've done to us, but even worse. We want to inflict a more severe punishment. We want to avenge. However, like with all the principles of the law that Jesus was dealing with in this sermon, and that's what the Sermon on the Mount really does, is it takes a lot of the principles of the law and expands upon them, and he makes application the way that God intended the application to be made, rather than the way that they were making it. He took the fact that they misunderstood the purpose and use of this law, and the fact that they believed that eye for eye, tooth for tooth meant that they had the right of vengeance. And he said, no. Rather than retaliating against an evil done to you, you should not resist. You should leave vengeance to the Lord. But we have to be careful to not take this and run with it either. We can make the same mistake with what Jesus is teaching here that they made with what Moses taught. To argue that the Christian is never to resist any evil in any way is to contradict the balance of Scripture. That's not what Jesus is saying. He's not saying that we have to be complete pacifists who never do anything and never say anything about any evil that's done and seek no justice. Ephesians 6:13, therefore take up the full armor of God so that you'll be able to resist in the evil day, and having done everything to stand firm. There is a sense in which we need to prepare ourselves to resist evil. But we need to do it in such a way that we stand firm on the principles of God, rather than leaning upon our own understanding. James 4 would say it like this: submit to God and resist the devil. 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 8 and 9. Be of sober spirit, be on the alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour, but resist him, firm in your faith, knowing that the same experiences of suffering are being accomplished by your brethren who are in the world. So what Jesus was saying was not you shouldn't ever put up any resistance against any evil that takes place in this world. He's instead saying that you should measure your response and stay within the bounds of what God will allow. And do it for the right cause and reason, not seeking to avenge, but seeking to defend what is just and right and honorable in the sight of all. To argue that the Christian cannot appeal to the civil authorities, for instance, in seeking redress in court, is to argue a very absurd opinion that Christians can't ask the government to do what God ordained the government specifically to do. It's the reason the governing authorities exist. Romans 13, verses 1 through 4 makes it clear that God has raised them up and giving them the authority, and that their job is to bring wrath on the one who practices evil. To say that we can't appeal to them to do that for which God raised them up to do, it seems to be self-defeating to me. It's just that foolish. In Acts chapter 23 and verse 16 and following, listen to what this says. The son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush. And to set the stage here, Paul is somewhere, he's out preaching. His nephew learns about an ambush that the Jews have determined to set against him. And it says he came and entered the barracks and told Paul. Paul called one of the centurions to him. Paul had already been arrested at this point, by the way. Paul called one of the centurions to him and said, "Lead this young man to the commander, for he has something to report to him." So he took him and led him to the commander, and he said, "Paul the prisoner called me and to him and asked me to lead this young man to you, since he has something to tell you." And the commander took him by the hand, stepping aside, began to inquire of him privately, "What is it that you have to report to me?" And he said, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down tomorrow to the council," as though they were going to inquire somewhat more thoroughly about him. "Do not listen to them, for more than 40 of them are lying in wait for him, who have bound themselves under a curse not to eat or drink until they slay him. And now they're ready and waiting for the promise from you." So the commander let the young man go, instructing him, "Tell no one that you've notified me of these things." And he called to him 2 of the centurions and said, "Get 200 soldiers ready by the 3rd hour of the night to proceed to Caesarea with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen." They were also to provide mounts to Paul, to put Paul on and bring him safely to Felix the governor. You see what's going on here? Paul is making an appeal to the Roman government to protect him from this mob. He wasn't out of place in making such an appeal and standing against the evil that would befall him. He's not being charged by God or by Christ in this teaching to do nothing at all, but rather to do what is just and honorable and right in the sight of God regarding these things. Look down in chapter 25 of the book of Acts. We'll pick up the reading in verse 10. Paul said, "I'm standing before Caesar's tribunal, where I ought to be tried. I've done no wrong to the Jews, as you also very well know. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything worthy of death, I do not refuse to die. But if none of those things is true of which these men accuse me, no one can hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar." When Festus had conferred with his council, he answered, "You have appealed to Caesar you shall go." Paul was a Roman citizen. As a Roman citizen, there were certain protections that the law of Rome provided him. And rather than be handed over to the Jews and killed, he was appealing to Caesar for the law of Caesar to offer the protections to him. And then in the midst of that, he says to them, "If I've done anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. You try me, you find out the facts, you decide whether I deserve to die. And if that's the determination of Caesar, then so be it. But don't turn me over to these guys who have no intention to carry out justice." He's appealing in the proper way to the proper people, not seeking vengeance, not seeking revenge, not raising an army to go slay them all, but appealing to the governing authorities that God has put in place for them to carry out the justice that God has put them in place to carry out. Our passage in Matthew is dealing with private retaliation, is what we need to understand. It's saying that I, as an individual, don't get to decide what you deserve for having wronged me. And then set out to get my pound of flesh or to settle the score with you, which is so often the way people behave. We have to understand these sorts of things. I want to look at a few illustrations that Jesus provides along these lines. Look at verse 38 of Matthew 5. No, let's 39, the latter part of verse 39. He gives an example of what he's talking about. Whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. Now again, many read this as an injunction for Christians to offer themselves up for abuse. That is not the way Jesus lived. That is not how Jesus exemplified this instruction. In John, the 18th chapter, starting in verse 19, Jesus is before the high priest, and the high priest is questioning him. And Jesus answers in verse 20, I have spoken openly to the world. I always taught in the synagogues and in the temple where all the Jews come together, and I spoke nothing in secret. Why do you question me? Question those who have heard what I spoke to them. They know what I said. And when he said this, one of the officers standing nearby struck Jesus, saying, Is that the way you answer the high priest? Now, what is Jesus to do at this point? Listen, Jesus answered, If I have spoken wrongly, testify of the wrong. But if rightly, why do you strike me? So Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas. Turn the other cheek is an injunction for us not to respond in kind, not to do evil to those who are treating us poorly. Jesus challenged the evil. He challenged the right of the individual to strike him. He challenged the reason for the individual striking him. He appealed to the authorities that were there and said, if I've done something wrong, testify the wrong. Let's hear it. Let's see the proof. He didn't get into a fist fight with the guy, but he did challenge what he did and appeal that it be stopped because it was wrong. Christians don't behave in the way that others may behave. Or we oughtn't to. Sometimes we do, I guess, but we oughtn't to. And that's what Jesus is talking about. When someone hits us, that is not license and liberty for me to just charge in and hit them. There's a right way to do things and a wrong way to do things. And you don't overcome evil with evil. You overcome evil by doing what is good. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 8 and 9. To sum up, all of you be harmonious, be sympathetic, be brotherly, be kind-hearted, be humble in spirit, not returning evil for evil or insult for insult, but giving a blessing instead. For you were called for the very purpose that you might inherit a blessing. And this is a hard thing for us to wrestle with, but it's a thing that we need to master. Jesus' point is not to invite abuse, but to reject retaliation and respond with dignity and righteousness. Then he offers the illustration of our reaction to a lawsuit against us. In verse 40, if anyone wants to sue you, he said, and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. This is an interesting one to me. It's dealing with the idea of one using the civil authorities to engender evil on the Christian by depriving him of personal property. If somebody wants to bring a suit against you to take your shirt, well, let them have your tunic as well. Let them have your coat also. Now, he doesn't address whether it's right or wrong. He doesn't say whether the person has a right to the suit or not. It's immaterial to his point. Whether there's justice or injustice here, it's an illustration about what our attitude should be. And he simply states that if they want your shirt, then give them your coat too. Now, to that, it may not have the force with us that it did with them. But to the audience that he was speaking to, they functioned under a very specific law. And this is what that law says. Exodus 22, verses 26 and 27. If you ever take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, you're to return it to him before the sun sets. For that's his only covering. It's his cloak for his body. What else shall he sleep in? And it shall come about that when he cries out to me, I will hear him, for I am gracious. If you take someone's coat and he cries out to me, God says, I'll hear him. You just don't do that. You give it back to him. You don't separate a man from his protective clothing. And yet Jesus said to them, if someone's trying to take your shirt, give them your cloak too. That cloak that you have a right to, an inalienable right that no one has a right to take away from you, you give it to them as well. What he's saying is that we should not allow anything, even our rights, to prevent our reconciliation with others. We should follow the examples of Jesus and Paul, being willing to lay aside our rights for the sake of the gospel when it's necessary. Matthew chapter 17 and verse 24, when they came to Capernaum, those who collected the 2 drachma tax came to Peter and said, does your teacher not pay the 2 drachma tax? He said, yes. When he came into the house, Jesus spoke to him first, saying, what do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth collect customs or poll tax? From their sons or from strangers? When Peter said from strangers, Jesus said, then the sons are exempt. I want you to notice what Jesus is saying there. Jesus is laying down the argument for why they shouldn't have to pay. However, he says, so that we do not offend them, go to the sea, throw in a hook, take the first fish that comes up, and when you open his mouth, you'll find a shekel. Take that and give it to them for you and me. Despite the fact that they had no right to tax them, Jesus said, we're going to pay the tax anyway. Matthew 26, 51 through 54. One of those that was with Jesus reached and drew out his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. And Jesus said to him, put your sword back in its place, for all those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword. Or do you not think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? How then will the scriptures be fulfilled, which says that it must happen this way? You know what Jesus is saying there? If I wanted to put a stop to what's happening here, if I wanted to stop the injustice that's being done to me right now, I could. The heavens would empty its angels, and they would come down and war with these people. But he was forgoing his right so that he could lay down his life and save mankind. He was willing to give up his right to reconcile men to himself. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 4 through 6. Paul writes to the church at Corinth, do we not have a right to eat and drink? Do we not have a right to take along a believing wife, even as the rest of the apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? Or do only Barnabas and I not have a right to refrain from working? Paul was preaching and teaching and laboring in the kingdom with them, and he is setting forth that he has some rights. He has some rights to food and drink. He has some rights to a family. He has some rights to not have to work a secular job while he pursues these things. But look at what he says, verse 11 and 12. If we sowed spiritual things in you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share the right over you, do we not more? Nevertheless, we did not use this right. But we endure all things so that we will cause no hindrance to the gospel of Christ. He had a right to all of these things, but he didn't exercise that right. That's what Jesus is saying. But many of us demand our rights no matter what the cost, no matter what the outcome is. Shame on us. A mature follower of Jesus shouldn't do that. It's not the way Jesus lived. It's not the way the apostles lived. It's not the example that's left for us. It's not the teaching. Matthew 5 and verse 41, the next example is our reaction to compelled service. Whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him too. Under Roman law, a soldier could compel anyone in an occupied country into service for 1 mile. The Roman soldiers, much like our soldiers, had equipment, and it was heavy, and they had to haul this stuff around, and they got tired as they marched across the country, and they could find locals and say, look, for the next mile, you got to carry my stuff for me. It didn't matter what business they had going on. They didn't get to say, well, I'm running my business, and didn't matter. They were pressed into service for 1 mile. Now, the law didn't allow them to be forced beyond that mile, just 1 mile. The Roman needs outweighed your own needs, at least in the eyes of the Roman law. And this is the very reason that Simon carried Jesus' cross. In Matthew chapter 27, verse 32, as they were coming out, they found a man of Cyrene named Simon, whom they pressed into service to bear his cross. Jesus was no longer able to carry the cross himself. The soldiers didn't want to do it. So they grabbed somebody in the crowd and said, it's now your job. And the Jews resented being compelled to serve the Romans in this way because it showed that they were under this foreign domination. It showed that they were subject to the Romans. And just like you don't like it when someone tries to compel you to do something that you don't want to do, they didn't like it either. The very idea of serving an extra mile was particularly degrading and distasteful. But that's the very thing Jesus here enjoys. And it's exactly what he did. He went the extra mile for the undeserving. That's what Romans 5:8 is talking about when it says, and while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. We were undeserving of what he was doing, but he did it anyway. He went the extra mile. John 10, verse 14, I'm the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, even as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep which are not of this fold. He's talking there about the Gentiles. I must bring them also, and they will hear my voice, and they will become one flock with one shepherd. For this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life so that I may take it again. No one has taken it from me, but I lay it down on my own initiative. I have authority to lay it down. I have authority to take it up again. This commandment I received from my Father. What is all that about? Well, it's just simply saying that Jesus went the extra mile. He was in control the whole time. He allowed these things to be done because he was willing to go beyond what was required of him. Matthew 26 and 53, do you not think that I cannot appeal to my Father and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? Reference again to what we read earlier. He had the power to put a stop to all of it, but he went the extra mile. It's not a legalistic parameter, by the way. It's not well, okay, if I got to go 2, I'll go 2, but I ain't going another step further. That's not the point. If that's the way we think, then we've missed his point. The next thing in verse 42, give to him who asks of you, do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. Jesus is illustrating through the picture of lending money, this idea that he has laid forth. It's not an unqualified rule for our money management demanding that we must always loan to anyone who asks us. Oh, if they ask, I got to give it. That's not what he's saying here. It's an illustration of what it means to resist not an evil person. It embodies the idea of not withholding what is needed, mercy, even to the enemy. That's what he was talking about when Luke 6:35 and 36 records him saying, love your enemies, do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, for he himself is kind to ungrateful and evil men. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. It is a call to be truly gracious and merciful. It is Matthew 7:12 illustrated. In everything, treat people the same way you want them to treat you. In all of this, just in this short passage, Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 through 42, we see that Christianity is a lifestyle of service and submission. The contrast to that can be seen in Matthew 20, verses 26 through 28. It is not this way among you. Whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant. Whoever wishes to be first among you shall be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. It is a life of forgiveness, of selflessness, of non-retaliation, of generosity to both friend and foe alike. And it is not a weak life. It is a strong life. It is not the strong man who strikes back. It's the strong man who can refrain, who can retain his dignity, who can continue to be righteous, even in the face of evil. And it's through such a life that the cycle of evil is ultimately overcome. Turn with me to Romans chapter 12. I'll start reading in verse 14, and I'll let this stand as our conclusion. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. Be of the same mind toward one another. Do not be haughty in mind, but associate with the lowly. Do not be wise in your own estimation. Never pay back evil for evil to anyone. Respect what is right in the sight of all men. If possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. Never take your own revenge, but leave room for the wrath of God, for it's written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. But if your enemy is hungry, feed him. And if he is thirsty, give him a drink. For in so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. That's the only way. That's the only way that the cycle of evil is defeated. It is the only way that the light of God shines in the world. It is the only thing that separates us from all of the natural thinking people in what is often called this dog-eat-dog world. We're challenged to not act like dogs. We're challenged to act like men and reflect the light of God in the darkness of the world. And the reward for doing so is great. We become sons of the Most High. We become the recipients of His grace and mercy and forgiveness. We become heirs of the kingdom of righteousness. And when the Lord returns, He will come to take us to be with Him. And that's the goal. It has to be the goal for each one of us. If we can help you in any way in connection with that, if you let it be known as we stand and sing, we will.
I know not why God's wondrous grace to me.
I have heard of a land on a faraway strand. In the Bible the story is told, where cares never come, never darkness
with their blessed ever frown. The street, I am told, is paved with pure gold, and the sun